'69 Spider, you've probably seen us do some service work on this over the last year or two. And in the summertime, this one had a fan blade that had busted apart and needed to be replaced. So we also put in a spacer to get that blade closer to the radiator, and we also put in a cowling, which was missing, to help keep the temperature exchange across that radiator a little bit better. But at that time, we had noticed that the water pump started to make a little bit of bearing noise. So we had pre-warned the customer that probably by winter time, he was going to need to change out that water pump, in which we have got. Here's the old water pump. And the reason you kind of always know these are going out, because they have the ability to tell you that. The water pump sits in front of the car just like that. If you were to look underneath the car, you're going to see a little hole right behind the pulley. That little hole is called the weep hole. And the whole point of that hole is that when the seal and the bearings are starting to go south on the impeller, it allows a little bit of fluid by. That fluid escapes out of that hole. And when fluid starts to drip out of there, you're on borrowed time. That means that you need to start thinking about getting this thing changed out. And in fact, that's what has happened. Once we pulled it out, we would notice that there was a lot of up and down travel on this. So this bearing was, and I realize you probably can't see that, but this bearing on this impeller was past it, absolutely past it. But this is kind of a unique water pump. This is often referred to the Spica style water pump because it has additional ports in it that goes through the Spica manifold. So we're waiting on that one to get in. It should be here any day now. Anyway, so yesterday I started to clean the front end of the engine because it had a great deal of road grime on it. Cleaning the surface for when I put my new gasket on the new water pump, I'm gonna have a nice clean flush fit, no leaks. So at that point, we decided to take the car outside and start to power wash the front of the engine so we had a clean mating surface. Couldn't get the car to move. Couldn't get it to move at all. The rear wheels move quite fine, but the fronts don't. They are completely locked up. So we have to investigate as to why that is the case. A situation like this kind of becomes a little bit of a hassle from our end because obviously the car was driven here. Obviously the car drove fine getting here, but in the transpiring experience of it being here is when things go south. That happens. It's not anybody's fault. It's just luck of the draw that it happened while it was here. But to a degree, it's a good thing it happened while it was here because it could easily be resolved. Now, when I have brakes in one part of the car that are locked up but not on the other part of the car, you need to isolate the conditions. It is more likely you'll have rear brakes lock up on you than you would front brakes because there are two things going on in the rear. You got mechanical and you got hydraulic brakes back there. You got the mechanical from the e-brake, which is very prone to locking up, and then you have the hydraulics, which, you know, if the brake locks up an individual brake, it's most likely the actual, you know, the brake caliper. If the e-brake hangs up, it's somewhere in the cabling system. That's somewhat easy to isolate. But when you have both front brakes locking up, you can almost instantaneously rule out that it's not going to be faulty calipers. It's going to be something's holding pressure on the line. There are only two things in this entire circuitry that theoretically, even on a US only '69 dual booster setup, there's only two things that could theoretically even do that job. That is potentially the slave on the booster could do it, and more likely the master cylinder itself is either snapped on the piston or the piston plunger is stuck right at where the front brakes get their fluid. The US spec '69 brake master is literally a needle in a haystack to find. They are not in abundance. So we're gonna have to pull this one apart and find out what it is. I'm tackling that first, but because I got pressure on the lines and these wheels aren't rotating, it should be fairly easy to find my problem, because once I start cracking back the lines, I should have a great deal of brake fluid trying to escape somewhere under a significant amount of pressure. So I'm gonna go after the brake master because that's the most likely culprit to me. Having a slave hang up like that happens, it's plausible, but I'm not buying that. It's more likely it's going to be the master. So we're going to get started on that and find out why these front brakes are locked up. All right, so we've taken the exhaust hanger system out of the way so we have easier access to this. Before I crack off the 4 lines to find out if I'm holding pressure anywhere, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna drop this down a little bit so I have easier access to them. Now also what I've done is I've taken the pin out of the brake lever, okay? You kind of have to be careful about this because oftentimes there's nothing holding the pressure of the fluid back right here. So I'm going to leave it on the actual rod, pins out of it for accessibility purposes, but other than that, that's it. So we're going to loosen these up, drop them out. Then we're going to use a actual piping wrench or a flaring wrench, if you will, and we are going to slowly loosen up. Slowly loosen up these lines and find out which one of these is holding pressure. To a degree, I'm hoping that this is not the problem. I'm hoping it's elsewhere, because to buy a brand new one of these is probably going to set you back close to 500 bucks. If it's a rebuild kit, you know, you're talking about 30 bucks. But if it's a full-fledged cylinder replacement, 500 bucks. Now this particular brake pedal assembly, it's kind of desirable actually amongst people who have floor pedal mounted cars and they want to upgrade to a clutch that's hydraulic driven and better braking system. They prefer to try to use a 69 pedal box assembly. The only problem with that is such a limited production run car, these aren't exactly available to everybody. Okay, now the bolts that come through here that hang into the actual pedal assembly frame, they're kind of unique, so you don't want to lose them. So I'm just driving them back a little bit so I can get this to drop down. There, now it's dropped down. Now I'm gonna crack these off and find out if I got pressure holding somewhere. Flaring wrench. Funny thing is there's 3 different sizes. Yeah. 3 different sizes attached to this. Okay, that one leads back a little bit, but it's not massive pressure. So that one is not my problem. And my brakes are still locked up, so definitely not it. Alright, so like I said, there's 2 different sizes here. We're gonna crack back this one. No real pressure on that, and as well as it shouldn't, because it's just the gravity feed from the reservoir. No real pressure on that one either. Now I'm going to go to the rear one at this point. You should probably think about this. Hydraulic pressure is not the same as air pressure. I've heard people try to get the calipers to move using air compressors. Yeah, I bet you probably put 90 square pounds of pressure on that cylinder if it's frozen caliper. When you look at this system, when being pumped, it's probably delivering close to 1,000 pounds of pressure. You can see where an air compressor is not going to move a whole lot of anything. Alright, there's a little bit of pressure on there, not a whole lot, but I'm really suspicious of this anyway, so we're going to pull it out and we're going to tear this down and see what it looks like on the inside. It may just need a rebuild kit, which would be nice. Or it could be the piston goes in here. It's got these metered holes around it, so when it sits on something, it allows pressure to bleed back so you don't lock up. Because that could just very well be completely impacted with grime, and that could be what's holding these up. Hey, the pressure coming off that line is pretty good. It may have an actual issue. Okay, so now that we got this out of the car, I'm not so certain this is going to be the actual definitive problem, but this thing definitely does have issues. So we put it in the parts washer, we cleaned it up. Now I'm going to take the boot assembly off of it, and we'll see if the bypass valve and everything is as bad as I anticipated. Okay, so now we've got the spring retainer out, like so. Okay, now I got the yourself well, okay? Now you see why I got the button. Now there's a piston in there that we have to get out because that tends to be the culprit in these cases. It does look like indeed it is seized in there, so we're gonna have to get it out pretty good. Should be able to just put a little bit of air pressure in there to get it out. There you go, it comes right out. The secondary piston on this looks like brand new. There's very little contamination on it. And the bypass or the blue ports, crystal clear. The O-rings are very clean. This is not a problem. You can put this back in and lock it back down now. Now, the first stage of this is definitely fairly contaminated. The bleeds are fairly plugged up and there's a lot of sediment on the O-rings. This isn't our problem, but it still needs to be serviced anyway, so we're going to clean it up because we're already here. Okay, so it kind of turned out what we expected it to be. It was what we thought it was. On these US market cars, that master cylinder is a little tricky simply because it's a rock and a hard place situation. And this is what I mean. If the master cylinder is bad, you got to do everything you can to try to save it, because the replacement of these guys is really, really expensive simply because of the availability of it, if you will. We got lucky on this one. Basically what has happened, and this one will need to be rebuilt at some point in time or replaced, but what we had is a lot of scale and debris that has settled into the chamber. Now you've seen me hone these out before. We had that special honing tool that was made back in the 1940s. Back when you would repurpose these, you wouldn't go buy new ones. You would keep working on the ones that were there until they were completely dead. And in this case, that tool came in awful handy for this. So we were able to hone this one out and get real good traction with the piston that goes in there. And it's working fine right now. So it's a win for the customer, but it's also working on borrowed time. Inevitably, we will have to do something about it, but for today, it's working fine. So I'm gonna go ahead and put the hangers back on for the exhaust, and we're gonna move on to the next little daunting task on this in the next day or two when our water pump gets in. Win for the home team. By the way, we always put these parts in the parts washer and clean them up. I hate putting grimy parts back on. It just seems so non-pro. So we put them in the parts washer, clean them up, make them absolutely as good as they can be without getting into overkill. That way, at least you know that thing's done. Our 22 mil piston assembly on this master cylinder in good shape, super clean on the inside. All the parts are in good cleaned up order. The exterior's cleaned up. Now you can actually read that it's a 22 millimeter piston in there. Hanger's going back on. Grease is removed off of it. One of the reasons why I like to make sure I get rid of all the grease is because you got your exhaust running right next to this stuff. It's so easy to start a fire. So that'll be that. Next, water pump. Okay, I didn't show you how to install the water pump for a few reasons. One, I don't want somebody following what I do to a T and then end up ruining something. A water pump is pretty simple, straightforward operation. A couple things you need to know though. Be prepared to remove your crank pulley. That is a massive nut that holds that pulley on, and they tend to be on there with a couple 100 pounds of torque, so be prepared to have to remove that. Two, when you put that water pump back on, keep in mind you have steel studs in an aluminum block. Don't be Mr. Armstrong and try to crunch those down. Following torque specifications on installing that pump, and make sure that you don't get crazy with the strength on that, okay? Because it's real easy to pull those studs right out of the block, and then you got a real mess on your hands at that point. Also, when you think about it, a water pump may be the most essential thing on this motor to keep it running, okay, and without damaging things. But here's the hook. If you've never done this before, if you have limited tools, it's not worth it. Just let somebody else do it. But if you are fairly mechanical and you do have a good arsenal of tools, go for it. It's not that hard a job. But the thing that you need to keep in mind is that when you go to put the gasket on, make sure the surface is immensely clean, because if it's not clean, you're going to have that gasket leaking on you. Okay. Two, make sure that you move around on the torquing down of the nuts. Don't go crazy and tightening down just one nut. Okay. You got to keep moving around, snug that surface to the block. Other than that, it's not that big a deal. The sequence of putting things back on is a little tricky though. You have to put the gasket and the water pump on. Once those are in place, then you can put the crank pulley back on. Once the crank pulley's back on, then you need to get the fan and the shim that is keeping that fan forward to the radiator on. After that, you got to put the housing on. Just have it dangling over the water pump. And then you put the radiator in, and then you put the fan shroud back onto the radiator. It's a little tricky. Don't get ahead of yourself. Don't be in a hurry. Don't put the radiator in first. That is the worst thing you do. Okay, that's the last thing that goes in. All right. But again, it's not a difficult job. It's just one that requires a little bit of pre-thinking, if you will, when you go to put it back together. That's about it. There is a finite level in which you can mill down rotors and they'll still be safe or not easily warped. When it comes to the early autos, those rotors are so freaking expensive to replace that you need to confirm that you have tolerance, and if you do, you want to cut them down and you want to use them again until they are out of tolerance. This particular set has got fairly good meat left on it and it's well within spec. If you have a hard time knowing where that tolerance is, you're right on the edge when it comes to these. We have quite a bit of room to cut on these, and we're going to. But it's nice having your own brake blade to kind of solve some of these problems. We use this for a lot of variations of other items that the actual blade itself can't handle. But it kind of came to us quite clearly one day that we needed to have a brake blade, because it's a shame that you have brake shops that don't want to cut down those really brakes. There's really no good reason. And not to mention, people turning brakes is kind of becoming a dying industry in this country. So there you go. That's why we have it. We're going to need one more pass through this thing to make it fully clean. Like I said, we got plenty of room. And now we'll have an early set of auto brakes that we can throw on the shelf and repurchase at a later date. Yeah, we still got plenty of room. And it's a good thing. We'll be able to turn this a couple more times to really clean up the surface on both sides really well. And we should be able to shelf these for a future need. It's almost a crime that we have to go through the process of trying to resurrect some of these early rotors just to have them on hand because of the expense. But it's really amazing what a set of Dunlops or the early Autos will run you anymore. I mean, they will really set you back some major coin. So we went and got us a really nice brake lay service center. Try to combat that expense. I'm really happy we got it. I'm going to run another pass through on this. Then what we'll do is we'll tape this off. Probably should have done this earlier, but we'll tape this off and blast this surface here so it's nice and clean. And these will be thrown on shelf for a future need. Okay, that's a really well cut disc, and it's well within tolerance, and it's officially saved. This particular brake, I didn't make it clear earlier, this particular brake is for a car that's getting ready to go home. It's an early Spider, and the brakes were on it, were working brakes when the car came here, but obviously we don't want to send the car home with rusty brakes, so we're cleaning it up and getting ready to send it back to wherever it's from. Okay, so these are at 9.55 millimeters thick. The casting says minimum tolerance is 7 millimeters, so I got 2 millimeters difference. We are in more than good shape, so it's nice to know we were able to save this.